So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Boy, do we have a lot to talk about today. Some great news on the pro-life front in the midst of some challenges, challenging Supreme Court decisions, difficult videos exposing what's happening behind closed doors at Planned Parenthood. But we have some good news, so don't go away. Also, you may have heard information about a new study claiming that women who do not have access to abortion are hurting. I'll have something to say about that because it's quite interesting. You always have to pay attention to how studies are conducted, and this is the reason why the study was performed. Because the claim that abortion hurts women was rubbing some people in the pro-abortion movement wrong. And so they conducted a study that manipulated research to try and show otherwise. But in fact, I'll give you this one piece of information. Women who tried to access an abortion too late actually ended up being glad that they had their child. Yet these researchers try to claim otherwise. So we'll unpack that later on in the show. Joining me today in just a little bit is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro, who joins us every Wednesday with his keen insights into issues of marriage and family therapy, but also into the world of same-sex attraction, gender ideology, and much more, sharing his testimony and experience working with clients as well. And we'll talk about a couple things in light of the closing of Pride Month. I feel like a lot of people either forgot or were too distracted by the quarantine about Pride Month, and so maybe you too saw this final rush and push for all of these outrageous claims, such as blaming the Catholic Church when children who experience same-sex attraction choose suicide. We'll be talking about loving friends and family members who identify as LGBTQ and how to hear their stories with compassion and honesty, not condemnation. So stay tuned if you'd like to weigh in on the conversation or have a question. Two ways you can contact me. Go ahead and give us a call at 1-888-914-9149, or you can head over to my Instagram at Timmerie, that's Timmerie, found at relevantradio.com/trending, and just comment on my story. You can submit your question through my Instagram story if you have something you'd like to say during today's show. First, for the good news. The Florida Governor, Ron DeSantis, signed a law this Tuesday requiring parents, or legal guardians that is, to give consent before a minor can access an abortion. It also, in this same new law, increases the punishment for abortion providers when they refuse to comply with not just Florida law, but the United States law that requires that we treat a baby born alive equally to its mother, or you and I, who are also human beings and persons. And so these are important things to recognize. It can actually save and change lives, especially in light of the horrific story of the videos I shared yesterday of Planned Parenthood on the witness stand saying what they do when, quote unquote, the baby just slips out, or when a baby's born alive, or whatever you want to call it there, and how they actually dissect and remove body parts from a baby whose heart is beating. So this law is a good thing and will save lives of the babies in Florida, but might I also argue of these young women who find themselves in crisis pregnancy situations? So often minors are taken to an abortion clinic or go on their own without their parents or loved ones having any idea that they're pregnant. They think that they have no choice, and let me tell you this, I've worked with these teenagers, both in front of the abortion clinic and that last stand before they enter that building, and in the crisis pregnancy centers. They don't want an abortion. Usually, the greatest obstacle in their life is just telling their parents. And that's whether or not their parents are pro-life or not. It's a huge obstacle. And so often what we see is that people of all ages, especially teenagers, will change their minds after a waiting period and after the close contact of loved ones who can intervene for them and give them the access they need. Now, sure, a parent or legal guardian might not always support taking a baby to term, but I've also seen crisis pregnancy centers surrounding women who were minors when they didn't have support otherwise. And lives of those babies have been saved and changed, but also those moms who were supported in career and work and in relationships and overcoming whatever obstacles and circumstances put them in the position in the first place to be in a crisis pregnancy. Because you see, it's not just the fact that she wants an abortion. There's a whole slew of various issues surrounding that decision and contemplation of having an abortion. And so this law in Florida is great. It's going to save lives that are already born, and it's going to help protect women who are contemplating abortion and who think they have no help and support. I've received a couple questions this week. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Again, you can ask a question on my Instagram story or give us a call at 1-888-914-9149. Two questions came up that I think are directly related that you've reached out asking, should I take contraception for health reasons? Especially, say, someone who's considering taking it for severe cramping and other issues. Also, another question came in about what can I say to a friend who is taking contraception? Well, actually, I rephrased it. She originally asked, what can I tell a friend to stop taking contraception? How can I tell them to just stop? I think it's important we rephrase that because sometimes when we make statements, it sounds like we're just telling people do or not to do something. I can be just as guilty of this as well. However, it's important to recognize if we're going to disagree with someone on something as quote-unquote personal as contraception, we have to be tactful and nuance the conversation. That's not always easy and often requires a great big deep breath, just like the other topics we're going to be discussing in just a little bit, such as what happens when your adult child leaves the faith or is living an adverse lifestyle. These are not easy topics to approach. First, I'd like to touch on the topic of taking contraception for health reasons. I'll name just a few of those health reasons that are legitimate, I get, such as some women have severe menstrual cycles, severe cramping and pain, irregularity in their cycles, and any number of other issues related to their cycle. Now, often doctors will give hormonal contraception as a band-aid to whatever's going on with that woman, rather than figuring out what the underlying health issue is. Could be something like endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, the latter of which I had, and if I had taken contraception for all these years, might never be able to have a child and would never actually fix and address the serious health issue I was struggling with, and also the complications that come with it. Again, it actually would have exacerbated symptoms. And so when we give contraception to someone who's experiencing severe cramps, it can actually contribute to the problem, although maybe giving a temporary sense of relief. Often teenage girls like to use contraception too because, hey, it puts your body in a state of pseudo-pregnancy, which comes with larger breasts, no period, and hey, the other element is you also can't get pregnant or think you can't get pregnant. These are all great things, but is it really that good for you as a woman? From a health perspective, just to name a couple, and we could do a whole episode on this. In fact, I'll post a link here in a few minutes to one of the episodes I did, just one full episode on contraception that scratches the surface on what you need to know about birth control that most people don't. I remember I did this episode a few months ago and people said, I had no idea. And these are the same people who I know knew better. So some of the reasons: hormonal contraception is a group 1 carcinogen made up of synthetic estrogens and progesterone. If you already have a predisposition to cancer within your body because of family history, not only have you already increased your risk of birth control by taking it, but if you have that predisposition, you are basically giving yourself a sentence to have breast cancer, for example. We also see examples of hypertension, anxiety, and depression. I've seen women in the crisis pregnancy centers because, by the way, those women who get pregnant, usually more than 2/3 of them, if not the majority, are on some form of contraception. You see, these women who would even utilize implants, say in the arm and other parts of the body, would have severe pain. Some people say, well, use an IUD. Well, that's also known for perforating the uterus and other parts of the body that creates long-term and permanent infertility and other damages to our reproductive systems. Those are just to name a couple health reasons. There have been Olympic athletes who didn't get to compete in the Olympics because contraception led to major health complications. So these are some of the health reasons for not taking contraception. Now, we might object from a moral perspective, but I have to tell you, there's a lot we can say to help a loved one, a friend, or even a stranger for that matter if the opportunity arises, by first addressing the physical harm and by helping to let her know, I care about you and your body, and you deserve more than contraception. And then that opens the door to go a little deeper into how contraception can fuel an attitude of use within a relationship, to go deeper into long-term consequences of contraceptive use, that it can actually function as an abortifacient. All great questions, much more to unpack, but these are ways to understand that contraception is not a good solution for health reasons, but also that contraception isn't good for our friends and loved ones as well. And if you do have a health concern, I challenge you to get in contact with a NAPRO doctor or a fertility care practitioner who works to deal with underlying health issues for women rather than putting a Band-Aid on the situation with contraception. We'll post links to access to ways you can dive deeper into this topic and receive true care by checking out fertilitycare.org, and we'll also post those links on social media and in the show notes for today. My guest today is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro. If you have a question during the show, just give us a call at 1-888-914-9149 or just comment on my story on Instagram at Timmerie, Timmerie. Michael, thanks for being with us today. I want to talk to you about this question I keep getting of how can parents, or even all of us, not just parents, let go of control for adult children who are living adverse lifestyles, especially, let's say, sexual lifestyles of living together, and maybe they've also left the faith.
Hey, Timmerie. So I think the first question I would ask if this was a family I was working with is, what is the situation? Because every context is a little different. So let me give you one example of something that people come to counseling with at my practice where I work. One of the things is sometimes children are, let's say, living with a heterosexual couple living together before marriage. So we know that's pretty common these days, right?
Right.
Yeah, so in this context, it is a union that in theory could eventually move towards being rightly ordered in the Catholic Church's eyes by going through the process of pursuing sacramental marriage, let's say if the couple is interested. But either way, I think one of the best places to start is prayer. And the reason this is so important is because every situation requires that grace of discernment of the Holy Spirit on how you can witness to the acceptance of the person. Your child is always your child, no matter what, without approving necessarily of everything they do. And what's great is no parent is going to approve of everything their child does ever. So this doesn't necessarily need to be handled completely differently than maybe other problems you've dealt with your children. And one example I have for that is if, let's say, a couple is living together before they're married, I think a great thing to do is just start with and ask them questions. How are things with your relationship? What led you guys to want to be where you are with your relationship? I think, especially for a heterosexual couple that are your children, that's a great place to just start with building understanding and trying to stay connected in a loving way. What are your thoughts, Timmerie?
I think this is great. I think the emphasis of starting with prayer is so important. That's going to help guide the conversation and how to approach the situation. I have a question for you, because one of the things that I was thinking of, Michael, is what if you asked a question if the opportunity arose, and even said, listen, you don't have to answer this. I just want you to consider this. Do you feel free to be yourself within your relationship? So asking your adult child who's maybe living with the person they're dating, because I think that this is key. A lot of the research shows that people who live together prior to marriage often don't feel like they can fully be themselves. They kind of agree to disagree on big issues that they really do object to, but they don't feel that security and safety, that permanence and fidelity of marriage. And so there's a lot of lying, there's a lot of insecurity and a lot of fear between couples who are living together. And so I think that question, without requiring a response, can maybe be an opportunity to plant a seed. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I also think that when parents and kids have this disagreement, so often I find that parents are worried that their ability to stay connected with their child will insinuate approval in and of itself. So like if I have them over for dinner, does that mean I approve of everything they do? And I often caution them against that because, you follow your own conscience. Every situation is unique. But ultimately, if your child is not close to you emotionally or spiritually, and then they come across a time when they're reflecting and maybe considering changing their mind, they're less likely to turn to you for advice or feedback if you've already driven them away out of fear. And so I recommend just staying as connected as you're capable to do within your own conscience. You've got to find that line for yourself. But that's what I would start with. And yeah, it's so interesting you said that, because I think a lot of times couples, when they are living together before marriage, there's that try it before you buy it attitude. And so I even remember talking with somebody who I was on a date with one time, a young woman, and she said, oh, I just want marriage to be like, I wake up one day and get married and keep living with a person I've been living with for a few years now, and it's no big deal. And I thought to myself, wow, how sad. It is a big deal. It's supposed to be a big deal because it's a covenant. It's a lifelong commitment. And so I think that try it before you buy it attitude does kind of leave you 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but yet creating scenarios where you're dealing with the types of problems that making a lifelong commitment can make more attainable and achievable to work through.
I'm thinking of a conversation I had yesterday, and that's joining us today is Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro. You can find him at healingandpeace.com. Michael, our mutual friend Christina Pineda from Matchmakers in the City was with us yesterday, and she mentioned this theory, and I'm going to get it wrong. You might be able to correct me here. We're talking about physical attraction and how there's this theory that if you don't want to sleep with a person within the first 60 seconds or so, that it's a no-go. That the physical attraction should have been there from the get-go. And we're talking about how this isn't really prevalent for women necessarily in the same way it is for men. But how could you see maybe this correlating to this whole issue of living together and trying it before you buy it?
It's so absurd. I mean, give me a break. There are so many cultures around the world, too, where arranged marriage, and even in the history of the Christian West, I mean, arranged marriage has played a role in the development of Western society in some ways as well. True. I'm not saying I'm a proponent of arranged marriage necessarily, but my point is you can develop sexual chemistry and sexual relationship over time. I even remember in high school, one of our core leaders for Life Teen, I was in a Life Teen program, told us that when he met his wife at first, there wasn't really strong physical attraction, but as they got to know each other and grew closer emotionally, he started to become very physically attracted to her, and they still are, and many years later, 20 years long, happy marriage with many children, with at least 2 or 3 kids. And I think what the example he gave us as young men, which was really cool, is to show that it's not so black and white, and that, this pressure from society that the moment you see them, if you're not just ready to jump right in the sack, something's wrong with you, or you got to switch gears really quickly. I mean, sexual chemistry changes over time. So if it can't be impacted at all, then we're all in trouble. So we've got to make sure that we don't sell people on this sort of fake Hollywood narrative that unless you're just overwhelmed with passion with the first 5 minutes, that there's no hope for the relationship.
And, I do have to say as well, physical attraction isn't there sometimes too, because there might be something going on. For example, before my husband and I started dating, I was never physically attracted to him. He was discerning, and I was pretty, set at the time. I made a very logical decision that after I've gotten all my education, it would be great to become a nun. I want to study first. I kind of hit that point. And so I didn't look at him in that way. And when I started to, it was like, oh, wait, my mindset has not been in this direction. And so we often put up roadblocks to seeing physical attraction in other people. And then all of a sudden when it's there, it's like we think we have to try something out in order to know if it's real or not.
And especially with people who, like you had, the context of your circumstances changed how you look at somebody. But imagine somebody that I see people all the time who have wounds of trust with the opposite sex. And so when they resolve those trust issues with somebody who they learn they can actually be very vulnerable with, that opens up a realm and a dimension of seeing them physically and romantically in a new way. So I think, trust your instincts. I'm not saying you should force yourself to date someone who you're not attracted to, but if it's not there right away and you like the person a lot, why not give it a little bit more of a try? And especially as this relates to parents and their children, this is just to remind everyone that whatever your kids are doing, I believe that if you stay connected with them in a loving way, according to your conscience, that does not mean you approve of every person they date or what they're doing. And we can get more into that, too, in another segment if you want, Timmery.
Now, Michael, I'd like to actually dive into this from another perspective. You and I wanted to talk about staying connected to our loved ones who are experiencing same-sex attraction. Maybe you experience same-sex attraction yourself. We'd love to hear from you. How have maybe your parents or friends or family members done a good job of staying connected to you while being honest with you about how they may disagree with certain lifestyle choices? I'd love to hear from you because I think this is something we can all learn from, and stories make a difference. Michael, so what about in the cases where, again, maybe two people are living together but they're same-sex attracted, or they're in, quote-unquote, a same-sex union or marriage?
Yeah, that's so tough, isn't it? Because we have this complex combination of factors where we love the people that are in our lives, our sisters, our brothers, our children, and yet we have these convictions that we just know that that's not necessarily how we see God wanting to work in their life, because we know the truth of God's teachings in the Catholic Church. And that creates a really big conflict for a lot of people of all different angles in terms of relationship connections. I think the first thing to do is to see them as always that person to you. If they're your son, they're always your son. If they're your daughter, they're always going to be your daughter. You don't have to abandon that role to show them God's love in a powerful way. That'd be my first instinct. What about you, Timmery?
I love that. I just want to repeat what you just said, Michael. Just because you disagree with the way a loved one, especially a child, is living their life doesn't mean you have to abandon your role of loving the person unconditionally, even when the issues are present that they're struggling with.
Well, think about St. Monica as an example. I mean, I know it's a very common example for, let's say, hedonistic heterosexual lifestyle that St. Augustine was known for, being a philanderer with women. But at the same time, she followed him around, praying for him around the Mediterranean, even though he was resisting his call to God's kingdom. And at the end of the day, how many parents feel like St. Monica? Don't give up on them. Don't give up on them. At the same time, it's not necessarily possible to just fight over and over again about the same thing, which is why I often point people to the Catechism, Timmery, and say, look, the Catechism makes a very clear distinction that we must accept with compassion, sensitivity, and respect people who deal with same-sex attraction. That means accept and approve are two different things. So if the Catechism highlights that those are different, acceptance and approval of an action, acceptance of a person, I'll say it again, and approval of an action are not the same thing, then pray, bring it to the Holy Spirit, talk to your friends, talk to other people that can get wise counsel to you on how to discern how that looks in your life with your loved one.
That is such a good point, and I love how you mentioned St. Monica, Michael, because St. Monica not only was praying for the conversion of her son, but for the conversion of her husband, and she called upon other people to jump in and assist during this process. For example, St. Ambrose was a huge influence on St. Augustine as well. And so praying for these saints' intercession, but calling upon loved ones who can also have an influence in a way that maybe you can't say certain things in the situation or relationship you have with your child. So don't be afraid to get that help of people who love your child as well.
That's a great point, because there are some people, maybe a sibling or someone else, that can, out of care and love, approach your child in a way that you can't. Or if it's your brother or sister, you can talk to them in a way your mom or dad can't. And I think what also is really good to remember is that sometimes people need to be listened to before they're willing to hear you. And are we willing to listen to people? And I think that's a good thing to think about.
That's Michael Gasparro, marriage and family therapist. Find him at healingandpeace.com. We'll be right back here on Trending with Timmery, taking some of your questions and talking more about issues arising after Pride Month.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Give us a call with your questions. Our toll-free line is 1-877-914-9149 and is sponsored by Charity Mobile, the pro-life phone company. You can also ask your questions if you head over to relevantradio.com/trending. Connect with me on Instagram, and you can ask your questions directly through there on my story. So, Michael, a question came in that I would like to get your thoughts on, especially as we are coming out of Pride Month and the advocacy for LGBTQ issues. One woman wrote in about her daughter, who's 14 years old and struggling with self-esteem issues and same-sex attraction. Now, as they're dealing with these issues, the mother had a question about how to handle it as her daughter wanted a pride and bisexual flag, and she didn't want to get it for her, but she also didn't want to hurt her daughter's feelings. What are your thoughts on the situation? Oop, I don't think we can hear Michael. We maybe lost him for a second. Have a connection. Okay, we are connected, Michael. Michael, were you able to hear the question? Michael, were you able to hear our question?
Yeah, I think I got most of it. So she didn't want to hurt her daughter's feelings by not giving her a type of a flag, a bi or a pride flag, right?
Right.
So I think the first thing is to think about as parents, I'm not a parent at this time, but any parent that has reflected on the seriousness of the nature of that role would think, I don't let my child have everything they want. And that's going to be based in an age-appropriate context. So that would be the first thing, is just remembering that even if some things make your child sad because they don't get that, I mean, you also wouldn't give that 14-year-old alcohol. You probably wouldn't give them all kinds of things that they ask for. So that would be the first thing to think about, is it's okay to set boundaries as a parent. The second thing is, out of care for concern of your child, after you set a boundary, whatever that boundary is, I don't quite know if that parent should or should not give that flag to that 14-year-old, but they definitely should check in with him after they set the boundary. And if they do say, no, this doesn't work, and we're not going to have that flag in this house for this reason, but let's talk about it. How do you feel about it? Checking in with our children's feelings, their thoughts, and being open and receptive, especially, Timmery, when we do that, if we're willing to reflect and summarize how they're feeling. So instead of just reacting and saying, well, I'm doing it for this reason, taking a moment and saying, okay, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. You feel upset because you'd really like to have that flag, and I understand why, and I'm sorry you feel that way. Even just that short amount of time we take to reflect and summarize can help cool down a really intense temperamental situation.
And that requires working on the listening skills, where you allow someone to talk, really listen to them, and try to, in a soundbite, summarize. So it sounds like you're saying this. That way, if you're wrong, they can correct you. And
right.
Maybe they still have more that they need to say after that point. They can continue to go on. So asking questions and leaving the door open. But Michael, I actually love how you actually didn't make it about the flag. You made it much simpler than that for all parents. Just like you wouldn't give your kids drugs. You wouldn't give your minors alcohol. There are a lot of things that you wouldn't give your minor child, and you might have to explain it in the context of the situation, but I think that the flag is a great example, saying, hey, you know what, this is a bigger issue that I maybe don't want to dive into, so let's not get the flag. I mean, simplify it a little bit. What do you think there?
Yeah, I mean, if you're at age-appropriate level, if your child is 17 years old and they want to really go deep with you about why that's an issue for you to have that in your home, I think it's fair to give them that context and have a discussion. If they're 12, it's quite different. So I think you have to look at the age of your child, the developmental level, and responsibility at a certain point gets passed on to your children too. So pick your battles as a parent, and that's where personal discernment is so important. But absolutely, there are some things you can just say no means no. We're not doing that, and we can talk later about it if you want, or for now, if you just want to tell me how you feel, I'll be willing to sit and talk with you. I think that's a good place to start.
I want to talk about the topic of same-sex attraction and the stat or various claims we hear thrown out there. For example, I was just reading something from a restaurant I love to eat at. They sent an email out in support of Pride Month just yesterday. And it's interesting because it has nothing to do with food. It has nothing to do with the founding of the restaurant. And so it's just another way for people to throw out their stance on various issues. And one of the things that the owner of the restaurant emphasized was how, in fact, it's Catholics and the church who's really causing teenagers to commit suicide because of their same-sex attraction, or even just people who are quote-unquote homophobic. But I'd like to present a different narrative here. Michael, if you'd be willing to join me on this. You work with young people, people of all ages, who experience same-sex attraction, and often there's a lot more going on in their life that's not being addressed. Can you speak to some of those issues? Ooh, Michael, I was just asking the question. Are you there with us?
Mm-hmm. I'm here now, yep.
Oh, great. We're sorry. We're having some connection issues today. So I was asking you the question. People often blame the church or people who are, quote unquote, they claim homophobic for kind of pushing forward the fact that kids who experience same-sex attraction are committing suicide. But in your work with people of all ages who experience same-sex attraction, you actually see a different perspective in that you see there are also other issues going on in these children's lives, and it's not just about the same-sex attraction. Can you speak to more of what's going on in the lives of people who are experiencing same-sex attraction?
Yeah, what's really interesting around this research is that it's starting to be researched more and more that people who identify as LGBT, as youth, are not responding the same way to people who don't take that as an identity but have same-sex attraction and have a conscience or moral guideline.
I think we lost Michael for a second. We'll go ahead and get you on the phone. That way there's a better connection. We'll have him in just a second, but I think what Michael was saying was so important to emphasize, that when a, let's say, high schooler who's experiencing same-sex attraction chooses a quote-unquote gay identity, that really perpetuates kind of this concern over identity issues and self-definition and overall issues surrounding suicide and other topics. But at the same time, there's another perspective as well. People who experience same-sex attraction, they're working through the issue, but don't choose that as a quote-unquote identity right away, and continue to kind of function their life and not reduce themselves to their same-sex attraction, often end up having a better outcome. And so this is where I think it's an important perspective for us to have, especially as Catholics. And it comes back to language that I say so often. If you experience same-sex attraction, I challenge you, don't identify as someone who's gay, because your identity does not have to do with your same-sex attraction. Your identity is a human created in the image and likeness of God with a great value, and your value isn't just reduced to your sexuality. You have many gifts, talents, and just the person you are alone is a good. That's what's frustrating about various examples we see in the culture, especially in movies and television, where there's this quota placed on television and movies to show LGBTQ characters, yet when they speak, all of their lines usually have something to do with their sexuality. You are more than the sexual makeup of your body parts, and that's important to emphasize. I believe we have Michael on the line again, connected to us. And Michael, we're talking about how you see there are other underlying issues that people with same-sex attraction are also experiencing, and this could also influence the suicide issue, but also this identity of whether or not someone chooses that identity in high school, for example.
Yeah, there's a big problem in a lot of the research right now on adolescents, especially with LGBT issues. It's a sampling problem. We're starting to see this come out more and more in psychological circles, meaning we're sampling groups of people with same-sex attraction who are predominantly LGBT identified and missing out on samples of young people and adults who have same-sex attraction and are not identified as lesbian, gay, trans, or bisexual. And what that means is some of this research is completely unrepresentative of those people who don't accept a gay identity. And so instead of just talking about suicidality as being a problem for one side or the other, let's just talk about making suicidality the enemy. Nobody wants children or adults to hurt themselves. And what way we can do that is help them feel less shame. And that's what good therapy does, is it helps people have less shame about their struggles. And let's talk about what good religion does. What does good religion do? It shows you the face of God and his unconditional love for you. So I'm tired of this narrative that there's only one way to help young people with suicidality, because it's just not true. We can help young people with depression, anxiety, and some of that can be connected with same-sex attraction issues, but it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and young people who do not identify as LGBT but have same-sex attraction deserve support with either counseling or spiritual guidance or family care that affirms their dignity as a child of God and doesn't rely solely on what we would call a gay-affirming agenda.
And this re-emphasizes how we communicate, whether you're someone who experiences same-sex attraction, really trying to live within the church, or whether you have a loved one who does. It's important to emphasize that our identity is never reduced to our sexuality, and often, especially for very young individuals, that when we kind of allow almost a sexual eroticism or even at times a sexual addiction to begin to overly lead to our identity as same-sex attracted or whatever it might be, there's a deeper issue going on that isn't just your sexuality but other outside influences that are impacting you.
And further, if you're a young teenage person without same-sex attraction, your sexual feelings of any kind aren't a stable long-term identifier of the nature of who you are. It might be part of your identity, but we know that religion, conscience, values, these are much more stable things to accept as something that is an aspect, as a core piece of who you are as an individual. And look, if somebody you know, if they are gay identified and they come to you and they have suicidality, help them. You know, no one in the Catholic Church should be encouraging anyone to hurt themselves or encouraging them to only accept and love themselves if they perfectly adhere always to church teaching. We want to help people accept God's unconditional love first and then move forward with a pastoral accompaniment with him. But I will not concede that somehow church teaching on this matter inherently leads towards suicidality. That's absurd. It's a baseless claim, and I really think people should assertively challenge that kind of rhetoric when it's thrown at us.
Amen. One last question I'd like to briefly touch on is how can we better work on befriending our loved ones who experience same-sex attraction, or if you yourself experience same-sex attraction, seeking out the friendships you need to be part of the healing in this disconnect with the community, whether it's gender identity disorder or same-sex attraction?
For me, when I hear this question, I think it's good to think micro instead of macro. And what I mean by that is think small. You don't have to think about how this would be in everyone's life, or how you would do this if you were the government or some kind of big policy-making organization like the hierarchy of the church. Go small. Who is someone in your life that you know and already care about who might struggle with some kind of issue like this? And think, how can I just connect with them in a way that's simple and sincere? Getting coffee, inviting them to Mass when we can all go back to Mass together, in small ways can make a big difference. I don't know about you, Timmery, but when people reach out to me, even for small things, I feel wanted and cared and loved. And so starting small with even the littlest thing as a Zoom call for now, just checking in on how someone's doing when you know maybe they feel like an outsider because of their struggle with one of these issues.
That's Associate Marriage and Family Therapist Michael Gasparro sharing his keen insights and experience every Wednesday here on Trending. You can find him at healingandpeace.com. We'll be right back talking about a new study claiming that abortion is good for women. We'll talk about that in just a minute.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
You've heard the narrative before. Abortion hurts women. Well, in fact, this narrative has been so effective because whether you're pro-abortion or pro-life, we know that it's true. How many stories and articles have we heard and read or just witnessed of friends who have gone through an abortion? And while they may not always be willing to say it, we've seen the impact that it has had on them. And so this is interesting because pro-abortion advocates cannot stand that claim. They can't stand that, in fact, it's a claim that swayed even some of the Supreme Court justices back in 2007, specifically Kennedy, to basically end up passing a ban on partial birth abortion because abortion hurts women, and even more so the later and later that abortion occurs. So it's interesting because a researcher by the name of Diana Green Foster ended up producing this book that came out just this past month, and the book is titled Turn Away Study. And it shows 10 years worth of research evaluating 1,000 women and the consequences of being denied an abortion versus women who had access to abortions and were able to effectively abort their child. Now, it's interesting as you look at the research because we have to first lay out some of how they conducted the research, and there's a lot to be said. First, they interviewed 1,000 women, and of these women, some had an abortion and some were turned away. Now, for those who were turned away, it was because they sought access to an abortion after the clinic's deadline for the gestational age or whatever their capabilities in that clinic were. Now, they specifically sought out abortion facilities where this was the latest gestational age, that's the development of the child, and there wasn't another clinic within 150 miles who would do the abortion at a time later. And so these women had no access, and they ended up giving birth to their children. So they conducted an interview of both of these women. They'd ask the women questions a week after the abortion or the denial of the abortion. And then for the next 10 years, they would interview the women every 6 months. Now, it's interesting because even the researcher herself said that the interviews had little to nothing to do with the abortion or the unwanted pregnancy. Hint, hint, a major red flag immediately that these questions were not being asked correctly. And it's obvious that there was an intention to skew data. And even in the interpretation of data, I'm fascinated by some of the claims that they tried to make. So more so, the questions had to do with other children that these people had, financial circumstances such as family income, and overall well-being. So here are some of the claims or interview questions that came up with the women who were denied an abortion and ended up having the babies. They said essentially that both the women who had the abortions and those who didn't had high anxiety and depression at relatively the same rate. They also claimed in the study that people reported they were glad they had their babies. Let me repeat that again. Those women who were denied an abortion were glad they had their children. Now listen to this. But here's what she didn't want. She did not want to admit this. She tried to deny this fact even though it was blatantly in her face. Now I have to tell you, I was listening to an NPR interview with this woman, the author of the study, Diane Green Foster, and my compliments to the interviewer at NPR, Terry Gross. I have to tell you, I think this woman's pro-life, and the fact that she's on NPR is pretty phenomenal. And even if she's not pro-life, she did a really great job giving fair kind of say to some of the data that was out there, and in fact challenging the pro-abortion stance of Diana Green Foster. I was fascinated. That's a side claim. So here's what happened. She did not want to claim that the report showed this, yet the statistics were there. The women were glad they had their children after being denied the abortion. So here's how they were rated. Before the woman ever had the child, and only a week after being denied the abortion, 2/3 of those women still wished that they had the abortion. But once we went 6 months later, these same women who maybe haven't even given birth to their children, most of the cases, that dropped. Now, barely over 10% of them, that's about 1 out of 10 of those women, still wish they had the abortion. The other 9 were actually glad that they didn't. So 9 out of 10 women, 6 months after being denied an abortion, were glad that they didn't have it. That is truth. And that is why the Florida governor this week passing a law that minors need parental consent in order to have an abortion is a win, because that means that there's more waiting time and there are more people involved who can help and love them. Because that's the truth of the matter. Women who have abortions think they have no options. And as time goes by, they realize otherwise. Now, those women who were denied access to abortion but had their child, after having the child, even more so, barely 4% of those women still wish they had an abortion. The other 96%, no thank you. They were happy to have those babies. Now, we see for those women who ended up placing their children for adoption, that was usually this remaining 4%, because these women still had to battle with the fact that they placed their child for adoption. And so I think that this is important to recognize when you look at this statistic. No woman really wants to just give up her child. And often I see in the culture, many of these women are frustrated because they wish they could care for their children and they wish that they could care for the child rather than have someone else do so. I've seen it. I've walked alongside these women who have made this sacrificial act of having placed their children for adoption. I've also walked alongside women who have struggled to be selfless and who have struggled and said they would rather abort their child than have another woman care for their own child. These are challenging situations and circumstances, but the bottom line is this. When we reduce access to abortion, when we pass laws essentially that limit when an abortion can be performed throughout the various trimesters, this saves and changes not just the baby's life, but the mother's. And so as I look at this study, some really great information came out of it. And although there's all this information that we can unpack, and we probably will even more so in the future, I think it's important to recognize that Diana Green Foster really tries to use this turnaway study about women who didn't have access to abortion to claim that abortion hurts women isn't true. Now, let me give you some of the facts. I have a huge academic book in front of me right now, published by the De Weber Institute for Bioethics and Social Research. It's titled Complications: Abortion's Impact on Women. Let me just name to you some of the physical consequences alone: injury, infection, infertility, future miscarriage, placenta previa, which is a bleeding during pregnancy and birth because the placenta is taking up more space than it should, heightened risk of breast cancer, autoimmune disease, maternal mortality. That doesn't even touch on the emotional, psychological impact that abortion has on a woman. So the claim that abortion hurts women is changing and saving lives, and researchers are trying to claim otherwise, but that's just not true. And when women don't have access to abortion, although it takes time, they end up being happy that they chose to keep their baby or maybe didn't have another option.